that Japanese wrote in his report that they've got to suppress the news of this, because if the word gets out, it'll be bad for Japan's image. I can't tell you how many times I've seen this expression, Japan's image, even today. It's one of the reasons why the Japanese do not own up to the war crimes of World War II. Today is the anniversary, 103rd year anniversary of the Samil Undong. And let's talk about it and learn a few things. Maybe remember some things you've known before, and maybe look at some things you learn in a slightly new and different way today. So let's see what we can do. So the March 1st movement, 1919, was an important event in Korean history, of course, and we're commemorating that event today and every year since then. I've decided to take the approach of a journalist today. Journalists like to ask the question who, what, where, why, when, and sometimes how. Let's ask these questions about the March 1st movement and see what we can remember and what we might learn new about it. Let's start with when. It was March 1st, obviously, but it was supposed to be March 3rd because that was the day of the funeral of King Kojong. And when 1919, why was that important? Why did it happen in 1919? Well, it follows a similar movement in China in 1917. The Chinese talked about the May 4th movement as an important democratization movement in Japan. But more important, after January 1918, so a little over a year before, Woodrow Wilson announced his 14 points for self-determination of small countries and of colonies. And this gave Korea hope for international support. It never happened. And Wilson's idealism was more idealism than reality, but still, Koreans took it seriously. And before the March 1st movement in Korea, there was a lot of activity in Japan with Korean students who were in Japan at that time, looking at Wilson's 14 points, thinking that it was an age of independent nations and such, no longer the colonial age. Well, the independent nations age came later, but not in 1919. It was supposed to be on March 3rd, which was the funeral for King Kojong, but they moved it up 2 days for fear that spies, collaborators among the Koreans, would reveal their plans to the Japanese authorities. So they let it out that it was something going to happen at the funeral, but they jumped the gun by 2 days and they were able to spring the announcement or the declaration before the funeral on the 3rd. Poor King Kojong, he was only 67 years old. Some people suspected that he may have been poisoned at that point. I don't know why, just that a lot of Korean kings were suspected of being poisoned. They talk about a king dying of natural causes. Poison is natural. Some men just can't hold their arsenic, you know. But whether he was poisoned or whatever, he died on January 21st, 1919. It took all that time to generate the plans for the big funeral. And the Japanese allowed that because, I don't know, they felt like they had to give some credit to the Koreans, I guess. And poor King Kojong took the throne when he was 12 years old, was ruled in the shadow of his father as acting regent for the first 10 years of his reign, and then had all the problems with the Japanese, the Chinese afterward. He's not a very powerful individual at all. And forced to abdicate in 1907. Why did he abdicate? Well, he sent a delegation to an international conference in The Hague, saying that Korea did not want to be a part of the Japanese Empire, for which he was pushed off the throne, and his hapless son was put on the throne for the last 3 years of the dynasty, which ended in 1910. You know, some people cynically say that the best thing King Kojong ever did was had a funeral, which gave a reason to have the March 1st movement. Who were the signers of the document? Here are the 33 men, good representation of Kim, E, and Pak, and O, and Han, and Hong, and Che, and a few others. The thing about them is that 16 were known to be Chandogyo members, 16 were known to be Christians, and one, the author, Han Yong-un, was a Buddhist. There's a discrepancy about who wrote it. Some say Han Yong-un, some say Chen Nam-sun, whose name does not appear here. He was undercover if he indeed was the author. They may have collaborated. I'm not sure how that worked out, and I'm not sure if anyone knows. There might be speculation about that. But the important part is that these two church groups, the Christians and the Chandogyo, were behind it. And why them? Well, they had a network. And there was a network of churches through which they could spread the word about this, this declaration. And the Chandogyo, of course, as a Korean domestic church and social movement, it started off as Tonghak, you know. And Tonghak was a response to Sohak, which is a word for Christianity. But Tonghak ran into trouble with the Tonghak peasant movement. We used to say Tonghak rebellion. You get in trouble if you say that these days. The Tonghak peasant movement. And afterward, they said, no, 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 we never wanted to be politically involved. We only wanted to be a religion. We got swept aside in the politics in 1894, led to the peasant uprising. But no, we're a church now. We're not going to be involved in politics. And yet they get involved in this thing. And then the Christians were important because not only did they have a domestic network of churches through which they could circulate this declaration and, you know, make sure it got out there that people could read it, but they also had overseas connections. And so they could spread the document overseas, and they were able to smuggle it out and have it read in Tokyo and in San Francisco and in Washington and other places around the world. So the fact that Chandogyo and Christians were involved in this is not so much because of the religious aspect, but because of the network of communication they were able to let it go through. And who were these signers? Well, I've outlined in blue here a couple of them. Son Byung-hee was the head of Chandogyo, and he was not afraid to step up and sign this document. It was fairly courageous. You know, the signers of the American Declaration of Independence didn't know but what they'd be killed for what they'd done. They all survived and lived good long lives, and these men all survived. They were not arrested and executed. The Japanese respected them. They arrested and executed other people, but not the signers. And there's Han Yong-un, who was the Buddhist monk, who is a great author, poet, and he was one of the signers, and they think was the author, maybe along with Chen Nam-sun, maybe not. I outlined in blue Yi Kap-sung. The romanization here is an awkward romanization. I copied this off of, I think, the Wikipedia page. But Yi Kap-sung, I outlined him here because I met him. He was alive until 1980 something, and I met him in the late 1960s. He spoke to a group of foreigners that I was in, and he was one or two that were alive still in the late 60s. So anyway, that's a personal connection that tells you that it was 103 years ago, but not that long ago when you know people who know people. Why? It was a chance to show the world that Korea was forced into the annexation in 1910. It was another attempt, like the 1907 attempt, to get the world to sympathize with them against the Japanese. That attempt didn't go well. And this attempt didn't go well at the time, but eventually it led to the liberation, and the declaration itself was a powerful and strong statement. The declaration, the content is very much inspired by the American Declaration of Independence, and some of the wording and such is parallel. And they called it the Declaration of Independence on purpose. There was no hiding the inspiration from the American side on this. They did this declaration because they wanted the world to know that they were not a willing part of the Japanese Empire. And they wanted the world to know, and they were hoping, gee, it's like the Ukrainians today. They're hoping that someone will step in and help them against the Russians. It's a similar thing of a smaller power being abused by a larger power. The declaration then was spread all over the world, literally, with copies smuggled out to various world capitals, Europe as well as the United States. They wanted the whole world to know that they did not want to be a part of the Japanese Empire. Well, what happened? As the events unfolded, as they read this declaration, they were going to read it at Tapgol Gongwan, the Pagoda Park, and decided that there were too many people there, too much chance for things to go bad. So they decided to read it at a restaurant in a smaller enclosed space. But here at Tapgol Park, they've put these bas-relief dioramas up of the different events. And there are a bunch of them there of different groups that were protesting the Japanese. The most graphic and the worst thing that the Japanese did in suppressing this declaration was at Cheamni Church in Chungcheongnam-do, I think it is, south of Seoul, just a little ways. And there at that church, the document had been smuggled out to churches throughout the country. And they were reading the document. They were meeting in the church and thinking that the church provided sanctuary. And, to any civilized people, the church would be a sanctuary. And the Japanese told them to stop reading it and quit discussing it and go home. And they said, no, we're at the church. And so the Japanese barred the doors and burnt the church down with, I think it was 103 people inside. Here's the bas-relief diorama of this from Pagoda Park. One of the Japanese officers who was in charge of this, not the suppression, but the line up that heard about captain major level had done this sort of thing, and the next higher level, a colonel or whatever, that Japanese wrote in his report that they've got to suppress the news of this, because the word gets out, it'll be bad for Japan's image. I can't tell you how many times I've seen this expression, Japan's image, even today. And it's one of the reasons why the Japanese do not own up to the war crimes of World War II, including the sexual abuse of women, the comfort women, including the massacre of Nanjing, where they say that the Chinese provoked it, and several other the war crimes, out and out war crimes. The Japanese do not own up to it the way the Germans do. The Germans say, yeah, the Nazis are bad dudes and we're not them. That was then and this is now, and we're not them. But the Japanese don't do that. They say, oh, that was us back then, but we didn't do that bad of stuff. They're very much concerned with Japan's image, and they're cleaning up the textbooks and not admitting to the war crimes that they very clearly committed during World War II and before, during this time as well. One of the bas-relief sculptures that captured my attention the first time I saw it when I walked through was the group of Kisang that protested the Japanese and read the document. And a group of Kisang women were beaten by the Japanese police. One particular woman is very famous from this event, and she is the famous, you all know her name, Yu Guangsun. And just recently, just a few months ago, they erected a new statue of her. This is that statue that was just erected, and the site for it is the Sodemun prison. Here's a drone shot of the Sodemun prison, which is a museum today for the brutality of the Japanese in this prison and the things they did during the Japanese occupational period, the colonial period. So the statue is on these grounds. I'm not sure where it is right now, but it's on these grounds now. Who was killed? You see reports of about 7,500 people killed, 16,000 wounded, and 46,000 arrested. I found another report that gives exact figures: 7,509 people killed, 15,849 people wounded, and 46,303 people arrested. So that's the scale of the brutality. 7,000 people killed is a lot of people to be killed for a peaceful demonstration. And The Japanese like to say there were Japanese policemen killed and such, but on the whole, the demonstrations were largely peaceful on the Korean side, but there was certainly a lot of violence on the Japanese side. This is just a shadow of the brutality of the Japanese. Just a few years after, in 1923, there was the Kanto earthquake. Kanto is the region around Tokyo. It was a Tokyo earthquake. And in the after effect of the earthquake, Japanese spread rumors that the Koreans were looting. There was a lot of fires and buildings knocked down. It was a very devastating earthquake. And so the rumors spread that the Koreans had been looting, and so the Japanese used this as a means of evening the score. And they killed about 6,000 Koreans on this occasion. So the blood on the hands of the Japanese about the Koreans is just really incredible. And yet it's the Japanese that have an anti-Korean book section in every bookstore. It's talking about anti-Korean. They've got no reason to be anti-Korean. The Koreans never did anything to them. Koreans killed one governor general, Ito Hirobumi, but who else did they ever kill or hurt? And yet the Japanese killed thousands of the Koreans. So it was a pretty bloody outcome after all was said and done. What happened as a result of the independence movement? Did Korea gain its independence? Well, yes, 26 years later. The American independence movement took some years to bring to fruition as well. It led to the Revolutionary War and then the settlement of the war. And the American Constitution wasn't signed until another 10 or so years later. So it takes 26 years to reach independence. Still, there's a connection there that this declaration is part of this independence movement. Immediately, however, the Japanese changed their style of government in Korea. They began what was called the cultural policy, the Munhwa Changchi or Bunka Seichi, and they changed the governor general. A guy by the name of Saito came in, Saito Makoto, and he was a little bit more liberal than some of the governor generals. He had been educated for some of his career in America. He was a naval guy, an admiral. Most of the governors general of Korea from Japan had either been prime minister or they became prime minister afterward. I think he was prime minister before he came to Korea, and he was governor general of Korea for, I think it was till 19 to 27, and then he was released for 2 years, then he came back again for 2 years, and then came back to Japan and had a position in Japan when he was assassinated. Japanese politics in the 20s and 30s is a story of assassination. It's a story that the samurai haven't learned how to put down their swords yet. And that's the kind of government of samurai. Saito was the son of a samurai. That's the kind of administration that they used. The cultural policy opened the doors to a lot of freedoms. Not total freedom, but literary freedom, for one thing. Koreans published a lot of magazines and newspapers, and they published short stories in these magazines and poetry. And some of our most famous Korean writers flourished during this time. Hyun Jin-gon, Na Do-hyang, Lee Kwang-soo, Chen Nam-sun, Kim So-wol, Lee Sang. These famous writers were able to get away with writing during this time. And I say get away with it. It was a cultural policy, an open door policy that allowed people to publish in Korean, of course. But the thing of it is, there was censorship. You had to watch what you did. And so this led the literature to some very symbolic kinds of stories. And these are stories that if you read them today, gee, that's a dumb story. You know, what sense does that make? For example, Lee Sang wrote a short story called Nalge, Wings. And it's a story about a man who was married to a prostitute, and he had to stay in the back room inside the bedroom while his wife was entertaining guests outside. And he had to listen to this while he was in the back room. And all he did in the back room was he played with pretty little bottles. He liked these pretty bottles, perfume bottles and makeup bottles. They were pretty, and he enjoyed that. And it's called wings because when he got out of the room once in a while, he just wanted to fly away and grow wings under his armpits and just fly. Well, you read the story and you think, gee, what a dumb story. Why do Koreans like this story? Well, it turns out it's symbolic that the guy is saying that we Koreans are like this man who's ducked in the back room playing with silver shiny things, the wealth, the modernization that comes with Japan, while Korea is being prostituted out in the main room, in the main bedroom, with Japanese visitors that come and go. That the Korean land is being used, and we Korean people are in the back room and not doing anything about it. So it's a real condemnation of Korea by Koreans, by Isang. Isang, by the way, is not his name. His real name is Kim, I forget his real name. But the reason he goes by Isang was he was an architect and was working in a company that was run by Japanese, like almost everything was during the Japanese period. And one of the Japanese supervisors says, hey, Isang, meaning in Japanese, Mr. Lee, Sang meaning Mr. Hey, Isang. Well, his name's not Isang, it's Kim Sang. And so he didn't think that the Japanese guy was calling to him. And the Japanese guy said, hey, Isang. And he still didn't look, because he's not he's Kim. And it's this business of the foreigner not paying attention to whether it's Kim or Lee, just throw them all together. And so he goes, the Japanese guy goes over and just yells in his face, says, Isang, I'm talking to you, why don't you pay attention? And so from that time point, he's okay, I'm Isang. And this was a subtle way of getting back at the Japanese in an indirect sort of way. So literature was published, but it was an open period, but very careful, very cautious. There's a lot of symbolic writings that came out during this period. You should probably understand the Japanese colonial period. There were three phases. The first phase was the takeover from 1910 to 1919, where Korea really didn't know what had happened to them. The prime minister signed the documents to grant annexation to the Japanese Empire, and people didn't even know about it. And then by the time it happened, there were a lot of people were saying that this Japanese business is pretty good. It's better than the old Chosun dynasty, and we're living better. And indeed, lifespan and healthcare and education, all these sorts of things that are measurable, improved during this early time. And this made a lot of people pro-Japanese, Chinilpa, collaborators, we call them. In 1919, then, with the March 1st movement, it opens this cultural policy, which ended either in 1931 or 1937. There's sort of two endings to it, because these were phases of the Japanese war. The Japanese went into Manchuria in 1931 and cracked down on Koreans, and this liberal cultural policy came to an end. And then it really came to an end in 1937, that's when the Japanese said, okay, you Koreans that have not taken Japanese names yet, you need to take a Japanese name. And from now on, we're not going to have these separate Korean schools and these separate short stories and magazines and newspapers. Everything's Japanese now. And Korean was taught in a few places as a foreign language in Korea. Korea is taught as a foreign language because the main language, of course, becomes Japanese during this final period, the assimilationist period when Japan really took over everything about Korea. When Koreans talk about the Japanese period, they talk about the darkness of those days and how awful it was. But it was three different things, and it was really awful at the end, not at the beginning. I met a woman in the 1980s who was 80 years old out in a country village. And she said something I'd never heard from a Korean speaker before. She said, in the beginning, the Japanese weren't so bad. And she had lived through all of it, and she'd seen this. And in the beginning, it wasn't that bad, but it got worse and worse as it went along. Opened up during the cultural policy, and then this big crackdown after 1937. What about the Japanese? What did they get out of it? The Japanese refer to the Samuel Undo as the Mansei movement. Mansei, 10,000 years, long live Korean independence. When I was checking some facts on this in Wikipedia, it said the Samuel movement, also known as the Mansei movement. No, it's not also known as the Mansei movement. Koreans never call it the Mansei movement. That's what the Japanese called it. And I don't know why, but this gives it a sort of a hardcore veneer, because Mansei in Japanese is banzai. And they cried out banzai at the time of the war, and long live the Japanese Empire and that sort of thing. So it gives, to call it the Mansei movement, gives it a bit of a edge to it. And that's a little bit the way the Japanese refer to it. For example, just recently, this guy by the name of Mark Ramsier, he's the Harvard Law School professor who a year ago wrote this really awful article saying that Korean and Japanese women were all prostitutes that were recruited to these comfort stations. And he was really criticized by it. And he wrote a rebuttal. It took him a year to do it, but he wrote a rebuttal that just came out fairly recently. And the rebuttal is even worse than the original article, because he says in there that the criticisms were unfounded, because he's not talking about all comfort women. He's just talking about the women who signed contracts. And you say, well, what about the Dutch women that were captured in Indonesia, or the Chinese women, or the Filipino women that were captured as prisoners of war and forced into these so-called comfort stations? And his response is, I'm not talking about them. I'm just talking about these contracts that were set up. And we say, well, what about the abuses of the contracts, where they didn't pay the money they promised? And well, I'm not talking about that. I'm only talking about the setting up the contract. So he sets up a ironclad argument because he only talks about one thing, and any exception to it, I'm not talking about that. And the trouble is that the press reads this article and says, Ramsier says that the women were not forced into the comfort stations, into prostitution, but they were willing contracted agents. And so it's a real distortion, because it doesn't, the press just covers the highlights of the story and not the details of it. Well, this same Mark Ramsier, when he talked about, in another writing, he talked about the Sawmill movement, he called it a violent uprising. How does that strike you? A violent uprising. Whereas Koreans think of it as a peaceful demonstration. I mentioned Wilson's 14 points, but it was also inspired by Gandhi and Gandhi's nonviolent demonstrations against the British. And the Koreans knew about this. It was a nonviolent movement, but it was the Japanese that created the violence. And yet there are Japanese figures, historians, and this guy, a legal historian, who will say the Sawmill movement was a violent uprising. So there's a lot of problems with the thing still. It's an unhealed wound. The Japanese don't face up to their abuses during this whole period, especially during World War II. But it's a point of national renewal for Koreans each year when they celebrate it. And we must never forget. Last picture. This is a picture of the huge celebration of the Declaration of Independence held on its 100-year anniversary. So from 1919 to 2019, with the president there on the TV screens, and a huge demonstration, a lot of music and dancing, and celebration of the March 1st movement. Well, it was a sad time, but it was a glorious start to the independence that we have in Korea today, and the great success that South Korea is today. The March 1st movement celebrated North Korea as well, but they, of course, don't have the success that they can brag about the way South Korea can. They don't have K-pop in the North. And South Korea wins Best Movie at the Academy Awards and the #1 selling Netflix video of all time, and that sort of thing. So Korea is a huge success, and they remember and still celebrate the March 1st movement. So that's what I have to say about it. Thanks for listening to me, and we'll see you on the other side.